it's still season 6. Wow, season 6.
Man.
If you're sitting there wondering, season 6, wow, how do I support these people? Just share it with your friends. That's all we ask. Rate us on whatever podcast platform. Tweet about us. Whatever you want. We love you guys.
We want to chat
as of now.
Let's talk.
Yeah, I would love to hear more from each and every one of you. Anyway, I'm rambling. Let's get on with the episode.
Let's do this.
Hello, and welcome to Temple of the Falls Pod, where our decks are not optimized, but our plays sure as heck are fun. I'm Andy.
I'm Bruce.
And, as you heard last episode, we wanted to kind of broaden our horizons, modern horizons. No, we wanted to talk more about our secret love of 60-card casual, a little bit more. Maybe not completely, but wanted to relate it back to Commander, and so I came up with this brilliant idea as a genius man, and figured we'll format this episode or this season, episode by episode, kind of talking about different aspects of deck building in itself, and every aspect is a new step. And then when we get to my deck tale, episode 8, I'll have a new deck. I'll have a 60-card deck, and it'll be fun because currently I've got like 1.5 60-card decks, and they're both just kind of thrown together with some lands, and they're not very creative. So this episode we figured we'd talk about some land, and get a bit more specific than we did last time we talked about utility lands, and talk about the idea of, how many lands, what kind of lands, and
I love land.
Next episode, for those wondering, is going to also be a deck tale, but we'll bring out one of both Bruce and my favorite of his 60-card decks, and it's so fun, and which is actually kind of what gave me this idea for this season arc of kind of making a 60-card, is because, as you guys will see, his decks always just have that creative flair of like the Commander state of mind, where it's expressing yourself through the build itself, and not necessarily an optimized play.
Right, and if any of you Commander players out there who've never touched a 60-card casual, or who are unsure as to how relevant any of this is going to be, trust me, I can talk about 60-card casual. But in the end, it ports so well into Commander, especially the style that I tend to propound as far as 60-card casual. There's all sorts of ways to play it because it is wide open, but I definitely try and bring a Commander feel to it. So you can expect us to talk about it in that way. So this is we're going to focus on 60, but it's still going to be completely relevant to just about to all of our listeners who are Commander only players.
Yeah, I think that all of these ideas on a basic level will be transferable, and we will talk about them because it's only natural to end up talking about Commander. Let's see. Previously on Land Central.
Speaking of a topic that's important for 60-card and just as important for Commander players, lands. Now, Andy proposed that we go a little bit more in depth on a couple of ideas, and I am all about that. So we wanted to at least start the podcast off with sort of when to use non-basic / duals. We're looking at if you're running a monocolor deck, what non-basics would you want to be running in those decks? If you're running duals, can you still run utility lands that don't offer either of the colors that you're looking for? What about 3-color, 4-color decks? At what point do you look at Kessig Wolfrun and say, no, this is I can't put this in the deck? Or is there Which, what other just colorless cards do you want to try and fit into the deck that colorless mana producers that just shouldn't go in the deck?
Right, because yeah, we'll get into it, but obviously there's a limit to. Sure, you're making a lot of mana, but can you use it? And then, I think we'll end up wrapping it up with talking about the very basic. Do you see them in everything? Evolving Wilds, Terramorphic Expanse, to an extent, Fabled Passage. Because I didn't realize this when I started Magic 4 years ago. Don't use them in monocolored decks, but we'll get there with time. I sent you some questions during lunch today, and I figure I'll start at the top. Duels.
Yeah.
When do you use them? Why would you use them? And how many? With regards to 60 card, you can use up to 4 copies of a card. Why wouldn't you use all 4, or would you? There's definitely been times where I've had a deck and I'm like, obviously I don't have these, Spire Garden, for instance. It's the Battle Bond land for red green. Obviously I don't have 4 of those, so I wouldn't put it in a 60 card deck. So there's one restriction for me, at least.
Right.
But there's something to having it in a deck.
Yeah. Well, okay. So right back to basics. Basics. Assuming when to use duels. Well, okay. First off, you want to use them in decks that are running more than one color. Whether you're commander or 60 card, that's where you're going to be using them. Obviously, there are plenty of 60 card decks where the focus is to steal opponents' creatures, and they have abilities, and you want to be able to use the abilities. So you want to have multicolored lands so that you can activate these other abilities for whatever reason. But primarily speaking, if you don't need the extra color, don't do it. Virtually every duel has a downside in that it either comes into play tapped, or you pay life, or you're taking, or you whatever the downside is to get that extra color, which almost always makes the basic land a better choice if you're never going to use the other color. So that's sort of where you start. The question becomes, how many colors? How big? So if I'm running a 2-color, let's say a green-white, well, how much green and how much white do I need? And if it's 2 colors, can I get away with just basics for a 2-color deck? And so much of that depends on how heavily you're into each of those colors.
Yeah, because honestly, that's kind of where I start anyway. Is
right.
I'll fill out this deck with basics, see then what I have for non-basics, whether they are, come into play tap lands like the temples or the life gain ones. Then you have to consider how many of each do you run, and part of me, I've made 2-color decks before, and a part of me has been why don't I just put in 4 of 6 different duels? And obviously the answer there is that you're gonna have you're not gonna it's not gonna be fast enough for one, so you're gonna want basics in that way.
Right. Part of the reason that you want basics, you really don't want to overdo the amount of duels you're running, because adding more duels means removing basics, because you're going to run X number of lands. So adding more duels means you're running fewer basics, which means a lot of ways you have to search for land is you're searching for a basic. So you don't want to run out. You don't want to have too few basics. You want to have at least a few basics of every color in your deck, because that allow if you only have 2 mountains in your deck, well then you definitely don't want them to be duels, because you want them to be basics so you can search for them.
Right.
Now, if you've got the kind of basics that you can, or the kind of non-basics that allow you to search, whether they're the shock lands or the original duels or any other duel that lists the basics, and you can, and the card is asking you to search for a forest or search for a plains, you can do that. But generally speaking, you do want to limit the amount of duels that you have. A lot of the land destruction out there really focuses on non-basics, so you want to limit the amount that you're going to get hammered on that. Obviously that is very meta dependent, but it's something to think about.
I think along with that too, with the land destruction, not only do they usually focus on non-basics, but the newer ones like Field of Ruin, for instance, lets the controller then go search for a basic. And if you don't have any basics, then you're actually just down a land.
Right.
And I've seen it happen.
I've played against opponents, especially in Commander games, who love to run cards that sacrifice all of your lands, find that many basics in your deck, put those into play. So if you're running enough basics, you can line it up so that all your mana is still there, everything is still good. You just lost your duels. However, if your deck is way overreaching on duels, then you are going to get hammered with cards like that. So I try to avoid that. Now, so having said that, why would you ever run duels? Well, because duels are going to increase the chances that you're going to have the colors that you need earlier in the game when you desperately need them. So, I did a very brief run through with my Marchesa the Black Rose deck, and with the idea being it's 3 colors, and I went through and figured out how many lands I was going to need in the deck. Not surprisingly, it came out to 38. My decks almost always run 40 lands, but I went specifically looking at the colors, and to get the land that I wanted by turn 5, 75% of the time, I was going to have to run 47 basic land. Okay, so I'm not running 47 basics.
Why not?
Well, because I'm only running 40 lands, and I'd like other cards in the deck to actually do things with all this mana that I'm getting. So if you're going to run 40, then you need to have ways to access the colors that you need, and that's going to come with duels, primarily with duels. And when I say duels, we're including the lands that tap for 3, or that can do 3 different colors, or tap for all 5. Get you any color mana.
Exotic Orchard type.
Exactly.
Yeah.
So, but when you do that, then you reduce the number of lands you need to get to the colored mana that you need. So if I run 10 duels out of my 40, it can reduce the number of lands that I need significantly to get to the at least the color requirements that I have. So that is primarily the reason I run duels. Now, in the end, I usually end up going through my stack of land, picking out the duels that are the right color, and getting the ones that I want, like the temples and a handful of others. And then I look at my deck and see how big a mana hog it is for a particular color. The difference between a creature that costs 2 and 2 green mana versus a creature that costs 3 and 1 green.
Mm-hmm.
So the creature that costs 2 and 2 green is much harder to cast on turn 4 than the creature that costs 3 and 1 green if you're playing a multicolored deck. If it's a monocolor, well, everything you're playing is a forest, so it doesn't really matter whether it costs 2 green and 2 or 1 green and 3. But in a multicolored deck, then you really want to have you have to keep that in mind, that if you're running a card that costs 2 green in a 3-color deck, how quickly do you want to be able to play that card? And if so, you need to really represent the amount of green that's in your deck. I tend to refer to this as how mana intensive is your deck.
So all else fails, just run all basics. Figure out the good split of.
Yeah.
I usually count the pips, and then figure out the percentage of pips, just in casting costs, not in activation costs usually. But then I count them all up in all colored pips in casting cost, and then I have a sum, and then I divide it into each color, and then find a percentage, and then use that percentage, multiply it by say 40 for a base level of for basics.
Yeah.
And then from there, I can figure out, what duels I want to add, what utility lands I want to add. And that gives me a rough estimate, but then you need to also look at what is an early play. Like if you don't get your first black in your curve until, I don't know, like if like everything below 2 or most things below 2 cost are like white, everything, and then like you don't have really black until 2 or later,
right?
Like you want to lean a little more toward the white, even if the pips are black heavy in the deck as a total. That also, I guess, like comes down to deck construction. Also, like maybe you built it wrong if that's the way it is.
Well, yes and no. I mean, I think
if we're dealing with just basics, I think the thing to keep in mind is that like it is like a needle where it's like, well, the deck is heavily black, so it leans that way, and then it comes back a little because it's white early.
Something that I always look at with the deck is how long do I want mana? For example, do I want to have a land drop on every turn until what turn? Until turn 5. Okay, great. Well, you can do that with the colors as well. So just because you want to land on until every turn until turn 5, it doesn't mean it has to be black every turn. And maybe you've only got 4 black cards in your entire deck, but they do need to be cast early. So you're like, okay, well, I need at least 1 black mana by turn 2. So then you do the math based on that. So on turn 2, you've seen 8 cards. Well, it means 1 in every 8 cards in your deck should roughly. This is not.
Well, you've probably seen 9 if you're playing multiplayer.
Yeah. So say 1 in every 9 cards should be a land that can produce black mana. And keep in mind, if you're also doing that, don't have it set up so that any of your lands that produce black mana all come into play tapped, because you're essentially adding another turn onto when you can get black mana. So you got to keep that in mind. So if that is what you're going to do, then you're really looking at it as, bump your math up so that you wanted to turn earlier and then do the calculations, because then you'll have some sense of how many lands do you think how many lands need to produce black mana to get that consistently. Well, then you just look at the numbers and figure that out. And whereas that same deck, instead of having, you might only have 4 black cards, maybe you've got 20 white cards. Well, okay, so when do you need a white card? Most of my white cards I don't need to cast until turn 4. Okay, do you need 2 planes by turn 4 or just 1? And then do the math based on that. So it's and just sort of go from there. And then once you get the raw numbers, then you get a sense of, okay, if I'm going to put, for a commander deck, if I'm going to put 40 or 38 cards in this deck, then you've got your percentages sort of worked out. Because you'll know that, okay, well, I figured this out, and I need 7 lands that produce black, and I need 15 that produce white, and whatever. Jam the numbers together and work out the percentage so that it fits with your 38 or 40 lands in your deck. And obviously, you do the same with your 60-card decks. I would be looking at more like 24 lands total, and you just work the percentages based on that. Yeah.
I think that also like then begs the question of like, I mean, obviously you've got mana rocks to help fix mana. You've got certain lands that help fix mana. Whether it's the filter lands, the storage lands. You've got the basic fetches like Terramorphic Expanse type, which we'll get to later. But like, to an extent, like there's been a lot of talk about Chromatic Lantern and how that fits in the meta of Commander as a whole.
Right.
I think it's a genius card that costs way too much monetarily, because for 3 mana you get perfect mana. So like, great. But what point, especially for 60 card decks, because the threshold is much lower, what is a general rule of thumb, or like a percentage, I guess? I don't know what you're thinking in terms of answer, but like at what point is it too much where you're just jamming in utility lands and things that do other things than create colored mana? Obviously it's deck dependent.
It's very deck dependent. When I add duels, I look at them as, when I'm working out when I need what color by what turn, I treat the duels as both. So they double up. They do double duty. Some people look at them as half. I just don't. I see them as a full on either side. Now, that's great until your deck is super mana intensive. So if you're running one of my favorite Archon, Kron, that deck is extremely mana intensive. I mean, Kron costs 6. It's 3 white and 3 green. So you can run all basics, but you're probably never going to get to cast him on turn 6 because you need exactly the right mana. You run more duels in a deck like that to increase your chances. The trick there, though, is that you can't then say that it's going to be... you can't treat the duel as one of each, because it is only one of when casting this. Most of the time, you're looking at a card in hand, and you're like, okay, this costs 5. Well, you've probably got the 5 on the board because only 1 or 2 of them are going to be colored mana. Mm-hmm. So that's fine. So in those cases, a duel works out just fine, because it's either the one color you need or a different color you need if it's a different card. It becomes a lot trickier when you've done your calculations and it works out so that duel is now having to play the role of providing green and white mana. It's like, well, it can't do both on the one turn. So you need to set it up accordingly. So you really have to look at how mana intensive your deck is, even more so than the number of colors. I think a 3-color deck generally is more mana intensive than a 2, but a 2-color deck like Kron, that can get... you really have to manage your mana with cards like that and with decks like that. And then when you get up into 4 and 5-color decks, well, then it starts becoming less about, okay, I've got a 5-color deck, how do I make the lands work? And more a case of, I have a 5-color deck, but this color is almost never used. Like it's on,
right.
Like the red is only on 1 or 2 cards. Okay, well then you make the adjustment for that, but practically speaking, it's a very different setup.
Yeah, and I like, there are definitely like tools out there to help with just figuring out numbers. Just like a rough estimate.
I mean, I always, generally when I build decks, I go on that rough estimate. The idea of what turn do I want it by? How many do I want? How many cards will I have seen by then? And just figure out the math and then extrapolate it for your 60-card deck or your 100-card deck.
Right.
Sorry, your 99-card deck. Your commander's not in the deck.
Or 98.
Or 98, yes, if you've got partners.
Or 97 if you have partners and a companion.
All right, well, you get what I mean. But it's and that's just rough math.
Right.
It's and it just gives you a general sense. Now, I mean, like for this show, I went and found the hypergeometric probability calculator.
Whoa!
Which
I don't even know what that means.
Essentially,
I did not take statistics.
Well, that's just it. This is a statistics calculator for people who don't want to have to figure it out every single time. Essentially, you get your hypergeometric probability calculator. You figure out your population size, which is your deck size. and you work out what you put in all the numbers based around your deck and what you want, and then it spits out a percentage, or it spits out the number of lands that you need of that particular type, or just the number of lands you need in your deck. And it also, more importantly, gives you the percentage of times when you're going to get that. So if you've decided that my deck should only have 33 lands, and that's the way it's going to go, well, you can pump that into your probability calculator, and it will tell you how many lands you're actually going to see on average, or how often you're going to see as many lands as you think you need. So if you're running 33 lands and you think you need 5 by turn 5, well, this is going to tell you what the odds are of that happening. Well, folks, they're not good. So it's nice running the calculator, because I think that this is yet another tool which will encourage people to run more lands in their decks. It is disturbing how difficult it is to get the number of lands that you want over the course of the game, and you start putting these numbers into the calculator, and you realize, only half of the time are you actually even going to get the land that you need. And it's like, well, okay, so half of the games you're not going to have enough land? Well, why? What are you playing? So I think fix your deck.
And I think that is one of many things that is speeding up this format, is the idea that like people refuse to add more lands because they want to play more cards, and so instead of adding more lands, they just need to have a smaller requirement. They need 3 lands by turn 3 instead of 5 by 5. And so like they're just playing smaller, like less cost things.
Exactly. And most people are going to then turn around and say, I don't need my deck to provide 5 lands on turn 5 because I'm going to have a ramp. I need my deck to provide 3 lands by turn 3, and then I will be churning out, I will have plenty of ways to search for lands or play mana rocks or whatever, so that I will be able to ramp up. And while I appreciate that, and I think ramp is important, why wouldn't you just play some more land? If you can have a way to draw a land naturally for the first 5 turns, then your entire ramp package can be mana rocks. And you're just playing rocks on top of the lands you're already playing. Play the lands and play your ramp package. Do both.
Yeah. It's tough because like I think it's a really good exercise to like get that first step in building a deck is always just adding more and more cards, but like if you have that 40 land and then you get it down to the 99, it's a exercise in figuring out what needs to be there, rather than just like, oh, this is good card. It's like, does this card advance my deck? And keeping that 40 land just stagnant is ideal.
Right. And I will say, having done the maths on a number of my decks for a long time, I don't necessarily do the math anymore, because I already know, like, okay, so this card costs this much, and I really want to be able to cast this on curve, so I know that I'm going to have to do this, and I know, based on what I've seen in the past, that I need roughly this many lands, and then, I build it on Architect, and Architect gives me a percentage of, there's stats button, gives me the percentage of the button. Colors that I think that I'm going to need for this, and then I take a look at it and say, okay, so how mana intensive is my deck? And how many more duels should I be running because it's that mana intensive, or because they're just, because it's a 3-color deck, and I think that I should have more ways to get multiple mana. So
because I mean, there's like, in terms of figuring out if you need duels, like there's a point in the game where the color you're tapping a land for doesn't super matter, because like at some point like you're ending up paying for generic mana costs in some way. So like how you're tapping is more important than what lands you have down.
Right. So Andy, before we jump into the utility lands, and a quick discussion of Terramorphic Expanse and his good buddy, maybe we ought to head over for the break.
Oh, I would love that. I gotta go turn on the oven to preheat it. But we're gonna throw it to break, and we'll see what comes out.
Sounds good.
We'll be right back.
All right. This episode of Temple of the False Pod is brought to you by Maze of Ith. Please, don't count Maze of Ith as a land in your land counts. Hey!
Hey!
Good to be back.
My oven's on.
Excellent.
And that's not a euphemism. It's literally on.
Heating to what temp?
475. Isn't that crazy?
475?
I'm pretty sure. I should probably go check that that's what the instructions said. I'll be right back.
What? Whoa.
I also had to take off my long sleeve shirt because it's about to get hot in here. Yeah, no, 475. It's the Trader Joe's fish nuggets.
Wow, 475. Holy
yeah, for 15 to 18 minutes. Oh, yeah.
My dinner last night, popcorn.
Hell yeah.
Yeah, we get Anthony's cheddar powder.
Ooh.
Anthony's cheddar powder, some butter, and some smoked paprika. Oh, yeah.
Yeah.
All right.
Yeah.
Ding,
Let's talk
ding.
about some
Round 2.
lands again. We're still live, so let's keep going.
All right.
Where were we?
So we were about to talk about utility lands. And by utility lands, what we're sort of talking about here is lands that don't tap for the particular colors of mana that you need. So these are lands that are taking away, or you're adding a land to the deck, but you're not getting any of the color requirements that your deck needs. So when should you be running these?
Whenever. Right? So the ones that we're gonna more talk about are gonna be the ones that tap for colorless and then have an ability.
Yeah.
You know, you've got like the hideaway lands. Like most things that are a utility land that tap for a color, like the hideaway lands, come in tapped.
Yeah.
But the ones that don't tap for color generally don't come in tapped.
Sometimes they do, sometimes they don't. But yeah, I mean, usually when I think about cards that tap for mana, or that the utility lands we're talking about, I think of cards like Strip Mine. I think of Kessig Wolf Run.
Yeah, that's what I was going to bring up.
You know, cards like that, so that they have an ability, and a lot of times you tap to use that ability, but otherwise you can tap it for mana, and it's usually colorless. So how many of those do you use? Well, so much of that is going to depend on your deck. Look at how much colored mana requirements that you have. Now, if it takes all of your land to get your colored mana requirements, then I guess you're not running any utility lands because you can't afford to put them in. If you have some empty slots, then you can put them in, but just keep in mind how many. Every one of those utility lands that you put in makes it just that little bit harder to get the colored mana that you need. So,
yeah,
you know, I mean, obviously, if adding a copy of Kessig Wolf Run to your deck means that you're now only running one mountain, well,
you're gonna have a hard time activating that Kessig Wolf Run.
Well, exactly. So, you know, keep that in mind. That's, you know, it just little things like that they sound real obvious when we do it here, when we talk about it here. But when you're building your deck and you've built this deck and everything looks great, and then someone says, "Hey, what about Kessig Wolf Run?" You're like, "Oh, that's awesome!" And you throw it in there, and then you pull out another land because you don't want to get any more land in your deck, and you think you're ready to go, and look what you've done. So
right, and on top of that, like if you're playing 60 card,
yes,
you can have 4.
Well,
but like, what is 4 Kessig Wolf Runs gonna do?
Well,
like, why? Like, what? I think this may be a topic for another episode coming up, but like what, like for land, I guess specifically, and like obviously this is case by case, do you have like a rule of thumb of like why you would choose 1, 2, or 3, or I guess 4 sometimes?
Yeah, so as you said right at the start of the show, if you only have 1, you're only running 1. But practically speaking, assuming that you could run 4, when do you do it? Look at the utility that the card is offering and make your decision based on that. Something like Kessig Wolf Run, practically speaking, if you're running 2 copies, you're not running 2 copies because you're going to have 2 creatures that get the bonus and trample. You're running 2 copies to improve the odds of actually getting it. Because obviously, if you've got 4 copies of Kessig Wolf Run, you're going to draw it earlier in the game than you would later. So then just sort of go from there. Now, I will say with 60 card decks, I'm never going to run 4 copies of Kessig Wolf Run because it's not a card I want until we get a little, at least into the late mid game or end game. Because early on, I want to be casting creatures. I'm not that worried if my creatures can't trample, because right now I just need creatures. I need stuff to block with. There's probably somebody who's wide open. I don't need the trample effect, so I'm going to hold off. But then it becomes, how badly do you need it? What percentage of your creatures don't have trample? How much mana are you expecting to have at the end? So is Kessig Wolf Run just simply there as, tap it, a red and a green for trample? So then you start looking...
Yeah, I mean, it's... Right. Yeah. I mean, if you're using it for just the trample, I mean, it's the same as Skarg the Rage Pits.
Right, and so you can use something else. But how badly you need it determines a lot... How badly and when in the game do you need it will determine how many copies you want. The other part is a lot of the newer utility lands, or at least there was a stretch where they did a lot of utility lands that were legendary. Well, I definitely not going to run 4 legendary utility lands in a deck because I can only play one of them. So if you ever draw, or if you ever get the second one, well, it is as dead a card as it can be. I mean, I guess technically you can tap the first one, play out the next one, destroy the tap one, and then get to tap the new one. But that's, those are rarer situations where you're not really looking for that. So,
and I think that like the legendary thing definitely we'll talk more about when it comes to the future episode of figuring out 1, 2, 3, or 4 copies.
Yeah.
Because like if it's your plan, if you need it, then you have to run more than you'd want. Just to make sure that you do actually get it.
Right.
I have a 2-color deck that I recently built. I've yet to play it just because of life. But I was like, I'm gonna challenge myself to put in as many copies of Temple of the False God as possible.
Right.
I ended up putting in 2 because it's a 2-color deck, and I need that color,
right.
And I mean, I was talking to you about this after I finished the build, and I realized if it was a monocolor deck, I could probably get away with it super easy.
With a monocolor deck,
as long as it's not like super pip heavy.
Yeah, I mean, you could go up to 3. Now, I will say that part of the benefit, this is one of those. It's bizarre, but Temple of the False God is far better in Commander than it is in 60 card. And it's better in Commander because it just pays your Commander tax. And with 1 land, when you look at 100 card deck and the way you mulligan, you're not going to be drawing that. You're not going to be having that card in your opening hand, and the likelihood of it showing up as anything other than a land beyond as your 5th, 6th, 7th, or 8th land is not real good. Now with a 60 card deck, you've only got 24 lands, and you can, if you include it as 1, well then it's 1 of 24 as opposed to 1 of 40. The odds do get a lot. It becomes a little more difficult in trying to make sure that, when you mulligan, you're going to mulligan more hands because of Temple of the False God. And if you start running 2 or 3 of them, well, then you have to start looking at it and saying to yourself, well, you know what? I am going to play Temple as my 4th land because I also have Temple as my 5th.
Yeah. And I think it's
to try and do things like that. So
I think it's tough too because like if you look at it kind of in a vacuum,
right?
If you have all 4 out, all you need is 1 more land, and now you have 9 mana.
Yeah.
But it's getting to that point of the 5th land, and that is 9 mana, where 1 of it probably makes it color, which isn't great. Right. But I think that kind of comes back to this idea of fixing, like color fixing.
Well, you mentioned the hideaway lands earlier. So let's Moss Warp Bridge. How many copies are you going to run? Yeah, green. How many copies of that do you want to run in a deck? Assuming that you've got, assuming you're playing primarily with permanents, you just have to. The only thing you're really considering here is that it comes into play tapped, and go from there. Because honestly, if your hideaway is your turn 1, then that's fine. But how many lands do you want coming onto the battlefield tapped?
Yeah.
Because this is a 1-for-1 replacement for a forest, but it's just that little bit slower. So, do you want to play 3 copies? I guess it will depend on the other lands you have in the deck. Because I personally would be comfortable if I'm running a monocolor deck. Then I'm A-okay if 3 or 4 of my lands come into play tapped. That's fine by me. But that's my personal threshold. As far as other people, they would say no, but or maybe some people would say that they're okay with even more. But
yeah, I find the hideaways an interesting example too, because like obviously perfect turn 1, like fine, whatever,
right?
Or not perfect, because like you don't generally necessarily know exactly what you need for one of those 4 cards, or of one of those 4 cards, but you'll generally have a pretty good idea of what you'll want. So it's really good that early in the game, but it is also pretty good later in the game, where you don't necessarily need to continue making more mana. Like you have a critical mass of mana producing, pip color producing lands, and there's a critical mass of non-color producing lands. And generally, obviously, that one's going to be a little lower because you want the color earlier. So having more is going to more or less guarantee that you get the colors that you need earlier. And then the utility lands as themselves, especially the ones that don't produce color, are like the critical mass is going to shrink the more the utility is not as relevant. Like, for instance, Arch of Verazca, you draw a card. Like, that's relevant, but like there's other ways you can draw cards without making it a land. Obviously, the land is nice because if you're stuck in a pickle and you just need to draw, then great. If you're an instant speed kind of deck, then it's great. You hold up those counter spells.
Yeah.
Comes back to you, you draw a card. But if in general you're going to have other ways in your deck to draw cards, then it doesn't make as much sense to have multiple copies of Arch of Verazca.
Yeah, so you look at it that way and you work it out. One of the other cards that I was sort of looking at is, and this is going to be a little less relevant, at least my example will be, a card like Urborg. Now, I'm not talking Urborg Tomb of Yawgmoth, just Urborg. For those who don't play against me on a regular basis, I love these legendary lands from Legends. Urborg reads, it's a legendary land, and it says, tap, add black to your mana pool. That's right. It's a legendary land. It does not come into play tapped, but it does tap for black mana. And then it also says, tap, target creature loses first strike or swamp walk until the end of the turn. So it gives you a little bonus. Now, how much swamp walk is out there nowadays? First strike is sort of there. Realistically, I put this card in my deck because of the art. But I only ever put a 1-of in because I just don't feel like there's any downside if there's only one copy of this card. It's just all upside. And I'm only putting it in decks where I have enough swamps so that if I'm looking for basics, they're still out there. So this is one of those weird utility lands that I don't think offers a whole lot of downside. It's like the artifact
it's
lands.
just, yeah.
So the artifact land of each color, if you're running one or two of those, there's just not a whole lot of downside there. I mean, the downside is that someone will, destroy all artifacts. And depending on your meta, that can be much more serious. But for our meta, there's just not a real downside to that. It just becomes a question of whether or not there's an upside for you to do it in the first place. So
yeah.
So I mean, we've sort of been dancing around this a little bit. So let's kind of get into it with the Terramorphic Expanse.
Yeah.
We sort of wanted to wrap talking about the Expanse and
Evolving Wilds.
Thank you.
And
Fabled Passage, I guess, to some extent. But
yeah. So with those cards, I guess less so Fabled Passage. They offer fixing, and for those who don't know, fixing is being able to choose what color, or to be able to recognize what color you're lacking and go literally fix your mana. Like, go be able to find the land color that you need to be able to play the spells generally your next turn, because with those two specifically, they come in tapped. Fabled Passage, if you have 4 or more lands, it comes in tapped and then you untap it.
Essentially, what Terramorphic Expanse says is this land comes into play tapped. Choose a color. This land only taps for that color for the rest of the game. That's essentially what you're getting. Now, that means it could tap for any color, but you have to pick the one that it's going to tap for the rest of the game. Now, but it comes into play tapped, and that's sort of the issue with this card. If you're running 2 colors, then you're sacking this to go get one color or the other color. Okay, so it's the same as a dual land that says when it comes into play tapped. You can only choose one of these colors. Whoa. So why are you running Terramorphic Expanse over a dual land that comes into play tapped? Because they're virtually the same thing. Terramorphic Expanse starts to become better when you're looking at 3-color lands. When your deck is running 3 colors. Now you can find one of any of those colors, and that's a lot harder to do with other stuff.
Especially with the example that you were talking about earlier, where if you have, if you're running 3 colors and you're running like 2 cards that have red in them,
right?
Like, you're going to be running very few mountains. So like, if by the time you get your Evolving Wilds or Terramorphic Expanse out, if you don't have any mountains, go search for a mountain,
right?
Because it's going to be such a small percentage to be able to find those lands just by drawing. And I mean, obviously with Chromatic Lantern, like there are all of these edge cases where like you can end up using the land well. There's also the fact that if you're using 60 card decks and you've got a few copies of either of these or both of these, you're starting to quote unquote thin out your deck, which like isn't insignificant, but it is generally like, if you had just like, if you find yourself searching for a specific color, especially in a 2-color deck, just replace it with one of those cards. It's the same thing that we were talking about with specifically duels.
And there are a handful of deck types where getting lands into the graveyard is a good thing, and Terramorphic Expanse obviously is great there.
Yeah, either lands in the graveyard, either being able to play lands out of the graveyard.
Yeah.
If you have landfall triggers, it's great. You play it, tap and sack, you get it. Play it, landfall trigger, tap and sack, another landfall trigger. If you're not playing a landfall trigger, it doesn't really matter as much to you. But, if you're playing a single color deck, replace it with a basic, because unless you have landfall, it's not useful.
Right.
That was I learned that too far into deck building. I think it was like my second deck. Somebody in our player group was like, "You do not run this card."
Yeah.
It just put in a mountain, and I was like, "Oh, okay."
Yeah.
I didn't understand why at first, and then playing with it, I was like, "Oh, okay."
Right.
But I mean, I feel like these cards, especially with this rising popularity of 3-color commanders, especially with more and more partners being added, these cards I feel like are starting to be are still undervalued, because I mean they're not excellent, but they when you start to have those 3 colors, it is exactly what you need a turn late, but it's exactly what you need, and it does get you out of those emergencies that having the basic of a wrong color does not.
Right. So as much as I'm not excited about this for a 2-color deck, when you're talking about a 3-color 4/5, this card just goes and gets the basic you need. I mean, think about this in your 5-color deck. I mean, it gets any color, and it's a basic, so you're going to find the basic and put it into play tap, and that's fine because you're getting the one you absolutely must have then. So yeah, I think that this is a great shot.
I think too, especially where, I mean, we've said it time and time again, we don't play optimally.
No.
But we do, the flip side of that is we do want to play.
Right.
So not being able to make the color mana that we want is difficult. Not having the land drops on curve makes that difficult. Whether it's having 40 or 24 land, depending on what kind of deck you're building, and then also not having the correct colors when you need them.
Right.
Is one of my this is why I wanted to make this the first lesson for me, is because it's the hardest thing that I still struggle with. 4 years later, I'm like, I don't know, just I'll as a placeholder, I'll put in a commander deck, I'll put in 20 and 20 for a 2-color deck until I get to the end of the deck build, and then I'll figure out my land then.
Right.
But then I'm staring at it, I'm like, oh, I forgot about utility lands.
Okay, so to sort of wrap this up, if people take nothing else from this podcast, take this one thing away. When Neon Dynasty comes out, and every set after that, look at the duels that are in that set, because they come out in almost every single set now. Look at them and buy a play set, probably 2 or 3 play sets, and just keep doing that until you have enough duels that you can comfortably add whatever number you need to your decks, and just keep going. And if you don't buy 4 of each, you only buy 1 of each, fine. Because just keep doing it every set, and eventually you're going to have a ton of duels that will be there to fix a lot of your mana issues. I've been buying dual lands, not necessarily originals. I've been buying as they come out, and I have a stack of 40 of them now.
Wow.
For each color pair. So I just go through them, pick out the ones that I want, and however many I think I need, and add them to a deck. So it just makes your build that much easier. Obviously, don't go overboard just because you've bought them all, and you don't have to jam them all into one deck. But you've got them, you have them. They're always going to be worth it. They're just always going to be worth it. I mean, and
I think that
even like a Guildgate, if you bought a playset of Guildgates, it's not hurting you. you didn't pay that much for it. It just sits there, and you can use it now, and then when you don't have to use it anymore, you don't have to use it. Whatever.
Yeah.
So.
I think the color fixing generally can be worth it, especially, I mean, even if it does come in tapped. And I think I think you're right. Like, don't just shove it in a deck just because the deck has those colors. But, like, experiment. Especially in, like, Commander, if you're trying to build lower powered, like, start with no basic, or
start with no duels.
Yep. See how it feels, and then go from there. Like, if you are, like, really struggling to get that second color, then either adjust your balance, or, I mean, put in a duel or two.
Yeah. I mean, I play low powered Commander all the time, and I'm running some of the most expensive mana bases out there, because I want to be able to use my cards.
Yeah.
If I'm gonna, the last thing I want is to be, scrimping and playing careful because my deck isn't quite as powered as somebody else's, only to find out I can't play my spells. That's insane. Buy real estate. Just do it.
Yeah.
Buy your land.
I think it's interesting because as a lesson for me, I mean, this all kind of comes back to, like, well, because it's case by case, think critically of if the deck needs it. Use as many basics as you can, and have that critical mass of lands, like the 40 or 24 or whatever kind of deck you're building, and then beyond that, like it play with the deck. And unfortunately, that's kind of what it kind of always comes down to, is like you're not going to have the experience and knowledge and for a lack of a better term, expertise of figuring out what your deck needs before playing it until you play it, and then obviously years down the line of just doing this over and over again. I mean, you've been playing for
ever
25 years.
Forever.
Since Ice Age. And I've been playing for 4. So, like, I don't have that initial reaction. I don't have that initial, like this is the number. I watch people draft and stuff on Twitch and YouTube, and I'm like, I couldn't figure that out. I still can't. But, like, just play, and you'll feel it. You'll feel like it, with practice. And that's the other thing too, is what's tough is, especially with Commander, because you're using so many cards, like it's hard to tell because it's so random. It's hard to tell if it's the right spot. You just gotta stop tinkering.
Right.
Just play it a bunch and then tinker. I think my oven's preheated. It's getting hot in here. I gotta go fill up my water.
I think it is time to wrap up.
It's perfect time to wrap up. I'm gonna go make some fish nuggets, some nuggies. But stay tuned for some cool tips, tricks, lessons next week. We've got a really cool deck for you. I'm not gonna spoil it, but Bruce is bringing in one of our favorite 60-card decks that we hope that you love.
One of Frankie's favorite 60-card decks, too.
Anyway, we're Temple of Falsebud, where our decks are not optimized, but our plays sure as heck are fun. I'm Andy.
I'm Bruce.
Thank you again so much for listening. We'll see you next week, and may your 5th land be the Temple.
Bye!
And then also your 6th land is... Wait, before you go, I just wanted to say thank you for listening. You can reach out to us via email at falsepodmtg@gmail.com or on Twitter @falsepodmtg. Bruce is at Manaburned, and I'm at Andy Weekend, though you'll definitely notice I use the podcast Twitter far more often. Now that we've got you here, make sure you subscribe, like, rate us on whatever podcast platform you use. It helps us out. It gets us more reach. Subscribe to us on our YouTube channel. Like a video there. Leave some comments for more casual enjoyment. Thank you so much for listening. We'll be back with some more timeless discussions about all things casual. So come hang out, and may your fifth land be the temple. Bye-bye. Should I do my best, Bruce? Bye!